Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I like that much better.
Hey,
It gives me great pleasure to introduce a friend and colleague, Professor Paul Lovejoy. So Paul E. Lovejoy is Distinguished Research Professor and Canada Research Chair in African Diaspora History at York University in Canada. His teaching and research specializations include African Studies, African Economic History, History of Slavery and Slave Trade, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Cultural Studies. A leading scholar of the history of slavery in West Africa and its diasporic communities, Lovejoy has advanced studies of the interconnections among various African, Atlantic, and Islamic systems of enslavement in the early modern and modern periods. He is a prolific author and has published over 30 books and well over 100 articles and chapters. His books encompass a wide range of topics in his areas of interest and include Salt of the Desert Sun, A History of Salt Production and Trade in the Central Sudan, which came out in 1986, Transformations in Slavery, History of Slavery in Africa in 2000, Ecology and Ethnography of Muslim Trade in West Africa, 2005, Consuming Habits, Drugs in History and Anthropology, 2008, which he co-edited with Nana Opoku-Agyeman and David Trotman, and Slavery, Abolition, and the Transition to Colonialism in Sierra Leone, which he co-edited with Susan Schwartz in 2014. Lovejoy is currently spearheading the Shad Biography Project, which focuses on recovering the histories and voices of Atlantic Africans, those born free in Africa and then enslaved to be transported across the Atlantic. Focusing on biographies, testimonies, and the voices of individual Africans from the 16th to the 19th centuries, the project aims to build and use an online digital repository to house the life stories of those who crossed the Middle Passage from freedom to enslavement. Lovejoy calls these Atlantic African stories freedom narratives to distinguish them from slave narratives, whose authors were born as slaves in the Americas. And he discovers in these narratives new perspectives on transatlantic migration and the influences of that migration on Western Africa, the Americas, and implicitly Europe. Paul Lovejoy is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, the founding director of the Harriet Tubman Institute for Research on the Global Migrations of African Peoples, and formerly a member of the UNESCO Slave Route Project. He's editor of the Harriet Tubman series on the African diaspora for Africa World Press, and serves on the editorial boards of many prestigious presses and journals in the fields of his expertise. Among numerous other honors, he has been awarded the President's Research Award of Merit at York University, the Lifetime Achievement from the Canadian Association of African Studies, and the Distinguished Africanist Award by the University of Texas at Austin. To end on a personal note, Paul has had a huge influence on my teaching and writing in many ways. As a graduate student at the University of Virginia in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, my late professor and mentor, Joseph Miller, taught a seminar on comparative slavery. His constant dialogue with his colleagues, Paul Lovejoy, Martin Klein, Claude Meazo, Patrick Manning, Joseph Inikuri, and others, made it feel like we were being taught by that entire cohort. Lovejoy's works have featured in my teaching of slavery and slave trade in Africa and the Americas, and in my scholarship on Euro-African trade and credit networks in the 18th and 19th century West Africa. His book on ecology and ethnography of Muslim trade in West Africa stirred my interest in Saharan as distinct from trans-Saharan trade. For this year's W.E.B. Du Bois lectures, Paul Lovejoy will be speaking on Equiano's world, beyond slavery and abolition. Today's lecture is entitled Vasa and Slavery, Participant Observer of His Age. Please join me in welcoming Professor Paul Lovejoy.
Thank you, man.
Thank you, man.
Well, thank you very much, Emmanuel, and thank you, everybody, for coming. And I particularly want to thank Matt Weinberg for looking after all the arrangements, and of course, Skip for inviting me in the first place. I'm greatly honored to be here. And I'm particularly excited to talk about Gustavus Vassa and his very interesting life and his impact on the abolition movement and his impact on modern scholarship and modern cultural studies. And Gustavus Vassa was a brilliant son of Africa. And I have son of Africa in quotation marks, because at one point, as you probably know, he was a member of a group of Africans in London who called themselves the Sons of Africa. Vassa experienced slavery and he observed the enslavement of others. He did this when the British trade, slave trade, and prosperity of slavery and British possessions in the Americas were at a peak. The second half of the 18th century was the height of the transatlantic slave trade on British ships. He established himself as an unusual and articulate intellectual and political spokesman of the late 18th century that arose from his personal experience and his ability to articulate what he had experienced and what he had seen. Vassa is frequently referred to, erroneously, as Walada Equiano, which was his birth name. He's been erroneously referred to as Walada Equiano, especially by modern scholars and many students who they've influenced, whose reluctance to accept Vassa's own preference as to his name I find curious. Now, before I blame everybody else for misnaming him, I also have to admit that in my work, my earlier work, I too referred to him as Equiano. But since the work that I've done, I cannot do that anymore, as I'll explain. Vassa was born in an Igbo village in the interior of the Bight of Biafra in about 1742, not 1745, as he says. He emerged as one of the most articulate abolitionists in the British world. His autobiography, consciously published at the opening of British parliamentary hearings on the slave trade in early 1789, reflects the life of a person who had been enslaved as a child and sold into transatlantic slavery, but who had gained his freedom and become a prominent member of British society. The individuals with whom he came in contact demonstrate that he was not only one of the greatest English writers of the late 18th century, but also an Enlightenment figure whose contributions to science were notable, while his religious convictions transcended his identification with Africa as reflected in his birth name. His skills in navigating the world of slavery, his ability to earn his own freedom at a young age, his management skills in British imperial projects, and his success in business in the City of London reflect a side of British society that subsequently was undermined by the increasing racism of global politics in the 19th century. What I want to do today is the first of 3 lectures, is I want to discuss and recount key issues of identity. I want to talk about Vasa as a participant and as an observer. I want to look at what he says about slavery in Igbo society, what his experience of slavery were during the 7 Years' War, which was the bulk of the period in which he was an enslaved individual, what he experienced and what he saw about slavery in the Caribbean, and finally, what he had to say about slavery in relation to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. For me, one of the reasons that I'm interested in Vasa relates to certain methodological issues that will run through my lectures. I want to know about complex meanings. How do we decipher the meanings of identity? How do we decipher the tools that we have to use in order to reconstruct the life of an individual, in this case, this particular individual? We're going to be looking at personal observation. We're going to be talking about his memory, about how his memory was reinforced, the extent to which his interpretation of his memory, like most people's interpretations of their own memories, have a private gain dimension to them. What do I really want to remember and what I don't want to remember? So I want to know about the suppression of memory, what he didn't remember or what he didn't understand, what he invented, how he used analogy, all of which I would contend were in his own way of trying to pursue accuracy about his own life. I want to know about his motivations, the ulterior influences and opportunities that allowed him to, in effect, write his own autobiography. And in fact, this addresses an important point that seems to escape the literary critics and historians of Vasa's autobiography. When and where did he write his autobiography? What accounts for the very different sections of the autobiography and the divergence of the autobiography from Vasa's life experiences? The conceptual issues that I'm drawing attention to include, what does he mean when he says Igbo, Ethiopian, African, free, freed, enslaved? What does this mean about ethnicity? What did he think he was doing? And this relates to the whole issue of self-naming versus imposed naming. Because in fact, Vasa came to accept his name, his slave name, Gustavus Vassa, preferred to use it, used it all the time without exception. And so in effect, he was involved in self-naming of himself, even though it was a name that was originally imposed upon him. So I want to explore a bit why he did that. I want to understand and interpret Vasa's preoccupation with religion, his Huntingdonian connection, his understanding of dissenting sects within the Anglican Church, and the birth of autonomous religious structures, beginning with the Quakers, then the two branches of Methodism, Wesleyan and Huntingdonian. Abolitionism and the visionary world of Vasa's imagination were powerful forces in his life that transcended slavery and racism. His understanding of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and his own personal understanding of his chi of his personal deity from Igbo cosmology guided him through his life, at least as can be gleaned and substantiated from his interesting narrative and indeed specific actions in his life. Now, as you're all aware, there's a controversy, at least for some people, over where Vasa was born. It's what I would call the South Carolina hoax. Vasa was born where he said he was born. Why would we doubt it? What we need to do as historians is to doubt anything that argues anything else. There's no reason to doubt him. As we all know, his principal biographer, Vincent Coretta, cites two documents that purport to indicate that Vasa was born in Carolina, and more specifically, South Carolina. In fact, there is only one document whose credibility has to be tested, and that is his baptismal record at St. Margaret's Church in Westminster in London. There it states, on the testimony of Vasa's godparents, Elizabeth Gurin and her brother Maynard, and likely their sister Mary, all of whom were present in St. Margaret's Church at the time of the baptism in 1759, that he was age 13 and he was born in Carolina. In his fact, it's more likely he was about 17, and according to Mary Gurin, he could only speak the language of Africa, that's her phrase, when she first met him 2 years earlier. Hence, the question arises as to why Vasa's godparents, Elizabeth and Maynard Gurin, said he was born in Carolina when they knew that their cousin, Vasa's owner, Pascal, had bought him in Virginia when he was buying tobacco there. His godfather, Maynard, was an accountant who was authorized to receive the pay of seamen while they were abroad and actually handled the affairs of Vasa's master, Pascal, who was his cousin. The Pascal and Gurin families were Huguenot families who had relocated to England and were very close. And clearly they knew each other's business very well. Maynard certainly would have known Pascal's business affairs and his involvement in the tobacco trade from Virginia, and that Pascal had never gone to South Carolina. What is written on the baptismal record is clear. Vasa was 13 years old and born in Carolina, which in the context would have meant South Carolina. And as I've said, he was more likely, however, 17, not 13. And this claim of birth in South Carolina or Carolina cannot easily be explained. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Nonetheless, other evidence demonstrates that the godparents falsely testified in St. Margaret's Church. Was Vasa asked where he was born and how old he was when he was baptized? We don't know. Possibly, but more likely this claim was the testimony of his godparents, to which he did not dissent. Vasa thought baptism would lead to his emancipation, and he may well have thought his African birth was an impediment to that goal. We will probably never know, but we do have reason to doubt the testimony of his godparents. The second document that is used to support a claim that Vasa was born in South Carolina is curious and ambiguous. We know that Vasa accompanied Dr. Charles Irving on the Arctic expedition of Constantine John Phipps, later Lord Mulgrave, in May 1773. The muster rolls for the ship Vasa was on, the Racehorse, the ship behind there, contains a reference to one of the crew, and that reference to that crew member is to a man by the name of Gustavus Weston, who was born in South Carolina. Is Weston to be identified with Vasa? Was Vasa even listed in the muster roll since he was not a seaman? but was the personal assistant to Dr. Irving. Dr. Irving was the lead scientist on the expedition. It's more likely, in my opinion, that Weston and Vasa were not the same person, but even if they were, Vasa would have stated that he was born in South Carolina, not Africa at the time, because that was what his baptismal record said, and it was an important document in establishing his identity as a free black, a former slave. The other documents, being his emancipation papers that he quotes verbatim in his autobiography, as well as his baptismal record, which establishes his name. In 1773, Vasa would hardly have stated, when he enlisted on the racehorse, that his baptismal record was inaccurate. And he certainly would not have been joining an official scientific mission to the Arctic as Irving assistant in the operation of this distillation apparatus. This is the, you can see, I hope, Gustavus Weston down here. He was Dr. Irving's assistant in the manipulation and use of this device, which Irving had a patent on and which was used increasingly on British ships. This was a test run for that, in which Irving, along with his assistant who operated the device, turned seawater into drinking water, which of course was a great development in navigation. It's actually a rather simple device. What it does is it captures steam off of boiling water. And on board naval ships at the time, water had to be kept boiling all the time. People didn't have matches. It was just easy to start a fire. And coal was being used to keep the fires going on board the ships. And constantly, seawater had to be boiled all the time in order to, in effect, have some control over the fire. And this device captured the steam that came off of the boiling water and condensed it through these pipes that you see inside, and therefore produced water that didn't have any salt in it. It didn't get rid of the smell of whatever was being cooked. So if cabbage was being cooked, that water tasted like cabbage. But nonetheless, it was a device that was able to keep, since it could be used 24 hours a day, it could produce enough water to provide enough water for the whole ship all the time. Now, I don't think I really need to recount the many scholars who pounced upon the supposed evidence for a South Carolina birth that actually doubt Vasa's integrity. Sometimes I've detected a certain amount of glee in some of the scholars' acceptance of the fact that there's doubt over this issue, liking to think that Vasa was a liar. Again and again I'm asked about this, and many people express surprise at my unhesitating assertion that Vasa was born where he said he was. I've been told that it really doesn't matter. Some even boldly stated that we will never know for sure, but it does matter. And we do know for sure. What we don't know for sure is where Sokka was located in Igbo land. So his statement that he was born in Sokka raises questions, but it doesn't raise any doubts about the fact that he was born in Igbo land. As a key figure in the movement to abolish the transatlantic slave trade, Vassa's experience of the Middle Passage was his calling card. On his book tours, among the many subscribers to his autobiography, and of course on the abolition movement itself, where he was born, mattered. If he was born in South Carolina, when his account of the Middle Passage, then his account of the Middle Passages and its horrors were a fraud, pure and simple. But he was born in Sokka. He virtually certainly went on a ship from Bonny. We know he arrived in Barbados. We know from Barbados that he went to Virginia, almost certainly the York River. And we know that from there he was purchased by Pascal and taken to England, although spending a number of months on the island of Guernsey off the French coast before he ended up going to London. That's his account, and to the extent that it's been possible to connect these with ships that actually moved, it's very plausible that all of this can be identified. I'm reasonably confident about that. Not as confident about his African birth, but nonetheless reasonably confident that we've been able to do that. So briefly, to dispel this now current invention, the evidence is overwhelming. First, he said he was born in Africa on many occasions. And we know again and again and again from testimonies from so many people that are published and everything, that the one feature that people pointed out again and again about Vasa is how honest he was. So he's lying about this when everybody who knows him and is close to him says no, he's telling the truth at the time. He identified his birthplace as Sokka in Elysee, and he described circumstances that he could not possibly have made up, or if he did manufacture the details, he fooled many of the leading intellectuals and political activists of the last 2 decades of the 18th century, which would make them look like fools. I have argued that 2 details in particular highlight his veracity. First, his explanation of Ichi's scarification. It's not that other people didn't describe Ichi's scarification roughly at this time. They did. The important point here is Vasa didn't get that information from those sources. He got that information because his older brother and his father had those markings. He did not. And he describes them accurately, and he uses Igbo words to do so. I think this is pretty powerful information, not only just about where he was born, but it's pretty powerful information about Igbo society, what he's talking about, and what he's explaining, which is extremely important, in my opinion, because his observations are crucial. Second, he was circumcised, which in England and Scotland at the time were considered the most barbaric practices known to human society. Only Jews, Muslims, and some people in Africa did it, but certainly nobody in the British Islands did it. And they didn't even do it in Britain for medical reasons. They didn't do circumcision for medical reasons until the end of the 19th century, 100 years later. If he was out to sell his book, he'd trash circumcision, but instead he mentions it casually. He passes through a country where people don't circumcise, and he thought that was really, really strange. He compares his own people with Jews because they circumcise. He mentions circumcision 4 times in his autobiography because he was circumcised. Third, he refers to incidents in his childhood that relate to snakes. One snake as large as a man's leg that passed through his feet without touching him. He refers to snakes when he's in the menstrual hut with his mother when he's a small child, and how many snakes were in there, and how she explained to him that in their villages snakes were venerated and you didn't touch them. Recently, a few months ago, I gave a lecture at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, the history department. It was really crowded. People were hanging in the windows. I mean, they wanted to hear what this white guy from North America had to say about their boy, you know, Walada Equiano, because they call him Walada Equiano because it was his birth name. They wanted to know what. Got to talking about snakes. My God, it almost caused a riot. Half the people in the audience were saying, "My village, we venerate snakes. He came from my village." We have so many Osaka's coming out that we didn't know what we were going to do. Osaka is an interesting problem. It's been identified, suggested that it's a place called Isake, just like Osaka, that's sort of southeast of Onitsha. I haven't actually been there myself, but there's been some research that's gone on there, and it's been very conflicting because some research reports one thing, and then when my team went in and tried to ask the same questions, I got answers that said absolutely false. We never did that. So we have very conflicting. So I'm not happy with any security in saying that Isake is the exact place. I also did a lot of research at another place called Osaka. Sorry, these places all do sound alike. That's the whole point. Osaka, which is south of Bende. We went there, and that was even more confusing because we discovered that the district it was in was known as Equiano. Yeah. Wow, I said, man, I'm going to rewrite all that. No, he wasn't born there. Forget it. They didn't take the name Equiano for the area. It has nothing to do with our hero. Nothing. No knowledge of anything about. This is a pretty remote area. The place was called by its neighbors a really pejorative term for a long, long, long time. And then in 1948, the villagers there at Osaka petitioned the colonial government. They said, we want to change the name of our district to Equiano. Nothing to do with. So the name Equiano is only recent. It has nothing to do with history, and they don't practice facial scarification. As far as I know, they never did. So I reject that place. But there are several other possibilities too, and maybe the snakes will lead us there. And I should remind you that he was accused in his own lifetime about lying about his birthplace. In 1793, 2 London newspapers asserted that he was born in the Danish colony St. Croix in the Caribbean and not in Africa. He responded vehemently to those attacks on his integrity. Modern scholars would do well to re-examine that incident. Obviously, the newspapers were using the biting satire that was popular at the time to dump on public figures, of which he was one. And the charges really reflect Vasa's prominence in British society more than they reflect anything about his birth. Even though Vasa's response and his overreaction to those accusations are really quite interesting considering the South Carolina accusations of today. Why did the newspapers stoop to critical satire? The timing reveals everything. Vasa was on his book tour in Scotland with his new wife, almost like a honeymoon. He's reported in a new account, a new little a newspaper report that I only just recently came across with a couple of days ago, in which he's reported walking down the streets in Edinburgh with his white wife, white is in italics. The timing appears everything. He was on his book tour. His popularity and public recognition had never been greater. He had just published the eighth edition of his autobiography. The book had been pirated and had been published in the United States, the Netherlands, and Prussia by the early 1790s. Translation, obviously, in the last two cases. It was timely for three other reasons. First, his namesake, or actually the great-grandson of his namesake, Gustavus Vassa Gustavus Vassa III was the current king of Sweden. Gustavus I, who he's named after, and I'll talk about more tomorrow, was who he was actually named after. But there was a current king, Gustavus Vassa, who was assassinated in early March 1792. Became the inspiration for one of Verdi's operas later on, that assassination. That news reached London by early April. A second incident that happened at the same time was the Danish government passed an abolition bill, the news of which also just reached London in early April. That abolition wasn't going to take effect for another 10 years, but nonetheless, the Danish government had given notice that it was abolishing the slave trade. And the third incident was the fact that the House of Commons was once again going to act on a proposal to abolish the slave trade, which it did at the end of April and which was overturned in the House of Lords in early May. So the two newspaper articles that attacked Vasa happened when all of these events were happening and coming together at the same time. The great-grandson of the man that he was named for was assassinated. The Danes abolished the slave trade. British Parliament was going to reconsider. So this was a way to attack Vasa. He wasn't born in Africa. He was born a slave in a Danish colony, Danes just abolishing the slave trade. And they were doing this at the time they knew they were attacking him because Gustavus Vassa III had died. So let me move on and talk about this one map, where he was actually born was about here, if it's the CK. And despite the conflicting evidence, I still think it has the strongest case for being the place where he was born. And when he was born, and I say 1742, which requires some explanation, which I won't give now, it was a period when the interior of the Bight of Biafra had developed a most amazing network of trade that was controlled by Aro merchants who came from this place, Arochukwu, and who established colonies throughout this whole area and who monopolized the slave trade of the Bight of Biafra interior and were the principal merchants who supplied Bonny, which was by far the most important port in the Bight of Biafra, but also extensively Calabar over here. And more than 90% of all of the Africans who left the Bight of Biafra left from either this port or that port. And a very large percentage of the deported population were put into the system because of RO merchants and RO trade. And Vassa's description of his own kidnapping and his description of the people who did it leave little doubt that it was RO merchants who actually kidnapped him and who bought and sold him. So this is the full system as it developed. But what I want to do in talking about being a participant and observer of his age is what he actually experienced, when and where, as opposed to reflections on that experience, and what he observed in various times and places, and what he understood from reliable hearsay. Without any question, because you can see that it's an autobiography and many other things that he did, he was clearly extremely intelligent and extremely perceptive. I don't think that there's any scholar who doubts any of that. We can question what he remembered about slavery in Igbo society because he presents a rather complicated contradiction about what it was like. And very understandably, he does not explain everything that was going on in relation to the institution of slavery in Igbo land at the time. He doesn't, for example, mention Osu slaves, slaves that were attached to religious shrines, and therefore he really didn't have a human master. He doesn't describe that. He doesn't describe the fact that one of the principal uses of slaves in Igbo land at this time was for funerals. They were sacrificed at funerals. Not usually somebody that was in the household, somebody who was bought special for the occasion of sacrifice. Which is why the terror here in being sold was that you didn't know what was going to happen, whether you were going to end up at a funeral or on a ship or what was going to happen. That was the danger, and that was where the real terror was. Vasa doesn't discuss any of that. He only discusses his own particular experiences in being bought and sold several times before he finally finds himself on a ship. So there's a lot that's missing there, which can be understood because this is his memory and what he can figure out from that memory. And as we all know, if you try to figure out what you were doing at age 6, 7, 8, and 9, it's going to be filled with a lot of speculation. It's going to be filled with a lot of what you were told by other people. It's going to reflect a lot of what you want to remember as opposed to not want to remember. Doesn't mean you don't remember things that are bad. It's just that isn't the kind of stuff that you go around and talk about so much. So we can't expect any more than that from Vasa. We do know as an adult he was clearly very interested in slavery and enslavement and the whole process. We know he knew other people from Igbo land, that he talked with them. We know that he knew other people who had experienced slavery in the Caribbean and had talked with them. He went to all the parliamentary inquiry debates and hearings. He went to every one. He heard all the stuff that was being told before Parliament. You can read it. It's in Lambert's collection of those in 4 volumes of what was said before those. You know, in some ways, though, that inquiry into the slave trade was very modern. It was like House or Senate hearings. People had to take an oath. They had to really only describe what they had saw or done and not what they'd heard about. And very modern, very interesting. Didn't mean people didn't lie. Ambrose Lace lied through his teeth. He lied through his teeth because he was involved in the massacre in Calabar in 1767, and he said again and again, he didn't know anything about it, except he was one of the instigators. We proved that from his own letters. So it's not that they didn't lie, but they did talk, and if you look at the testimony, you'll see what I mean about the extent to which Vasa knew from what he could pick up from other people. Now, nothing that was said in those parliamentary inquiries were an influence on what he wrote in his book, because everything he heard in the parliamentary inquiries, he heard after he'd written and published his book. But it doesn't mean that on his book tours through Scotland, through Ireland, through many, many, many parts of England, that he didn't talk about what he heard in the parliamentary. Of course he did. He learned a lot, of course, from Clarkson's investigations. He knew Clarkson, although bizarre. Clarkson wrote a lot. I hope, I've looked at everything that he's done, because a lot he didn't publish. He published a lot, but he wrote a lot more than he didn't publish. It's in everywhere from Chicago to the Huntington Library to everywhere. He never, ever mentions Vasa. He wrote a letter of introduction introducing Vasa to people, so we know they knew each other, but he never mentioned or gave any credit to what Vasa did. He's not the only one. So when he wrote about the Middle Passage, he had already learned a lot besides what he knew, that's for sure. And he chose to write what he revealed and in the manner in which he wanted it to be heard. And there's no question that what his public statements, even before he published his autobiography, and what he was printing in newspapers and saying to people had a strong influence on the passage of the Dolman Act in 1788. That act was one of the futile efforts of the British government to reform slavery by limiting the number of people who could be on a slave ship, depending upon the size of the ship because of the conditions on board the ship. Now, Vasa was never called to testify before the parliamentary committee, even though he asked to be. But everyone on the committee would have known about his revelations about the Middle Passage because they would have read his book. Because he gave the book to a lot of people, not just subscribers. In the book, he recounted what he experienced as a slave, what he witnessed, and what he heard about. And beyond his autobiography, he also had heard a lot of through his travels around England and his talking with people. So when we look at his experience and his understanding of slavery in the Bight of Biafra, which is based on his own experience and his memory, his enslavement on board ship, his trip to the coast before he got on ship, what happened in Barbados, the way the slaves were bought and sold, all of that rings true with the additions that I've already given in terms of Osu slavery and other things so that we understand a broader context, which he does not explain and may not even fully understood. The next part of his experience as a slave, however, once he reaches Virginia and from there through the 7 Years' War, is anything but typical of slavery or the experiences of Africans in the Americas. He had a relatively easy time of it in Virginia for the couple of months that he was there. His job was fanning his sick master. You could do worse. That's why Pascal saw him, liked him, bought him. The 7 Years' War, there were some perilous moments in battle. He also got quite sick at one point and was hospitalized. But there were almost no other slaves on board any of the ships he was on. He was, in effect, the personal valet of the ship captain, Pascal, when he was captain of a ship, or when he was second or third command on a bigger ship, he was his servant, his personal servant. He lived in the same quarters. He went to the same meals. He was around him all the time. And it's in fact there in the 7 Years' War that he got his education, because on all of those big Navy ships, there were a fair number of boys, and when things weren't happening, because you were just floating around in the ocean somewhere, or in port somewhere, those boys went to school on board the ship, and that's where he got his education. He got his education on board ship during the 7 Years' War. And he recounts in great details exactly what he learned. And by the end of the 7 Years' War, he was keeping a diary. We know that because it was confiscated. He says, he writes that a lot of his things when he was at the end of the 7 Years' War that belonged to him were taken from him. Because his master, Pascal, reneged. In the heat of battle, obviously had promised the boy that, you know, if we get out of this, you're going to be free. You're going to get prize money. When the war was over, nope, he didn't get freedom and he didn't get any prize money. Instead, he got sold to the Caribbean and was sold ultimately to a master in Montserrat. So his 7 Years' War experience as a slave and what he did within the Navy is very interesting, but it's very unusual, not typical of slavery at the time for most people. Nor was his slavery in the Caribbean typical, because when he was sold, he was literate. He had experience at sea. He could do math. So he's not going to end up on a plantation working. He's going to end up being bought by a merchant by the name of King, who was supposedly a Quaker from Philadelphia. Why a Quaker from Philadelphia was dealing with slaves at this time is another issue. But so he ended up being a principal employee of a merchant in the Caribbean who operated out of Montserrat and operated and bought and sold a whole bunch of things within the inter-Caribbean trade, including slaves. So that was unusual for him, and as a result, he was able to trade on his own account, which not only improved his ability at business, but also earned him his freedom. And I mentioned 1742 as the year of his birth. Why does that matter to me? Why does 1742, 1745, why could it possibly matter? It matters when he was in 1759, when he was baptized, and I say he was 17. It means that when he bought his own freedom, he was 24. If he was born 3 years later, he would have been 21. If he was born in 1747, which has even been argued, he was 19. The lower the age, the more difficult it would have been for anybody, no matter how good they were at business and how many opportunities they had to buy enough money to buy their own freedom. That's why, for me, the fact that I think he miscalculated on figuring out when he was born matters. How he miscalculated, he changed the date in a later edition as to when he first arrived in England. He realized that what he said in his first publication was wrong, and he arrived earlier than he said, a couple of years earlier. And in fact, we know very well, thanks to Vincent Coretta's wonderful research on this, we know exactly when he arrived in England in 1754. What ship, came from Virginia, fits all perfectly. So, he recalculated when he arrived in England, but he didn't recalculate when he was born. If he had taken the same number of years off when the date he said he was born, you get back to 1742. So finally, how many more minutes do I have, or am I close?
Oh, you're fine.
Thanks. Because what I want to do in the last part is to look at 4 particular incidents that he was involved in or he knew about, and what it tells us about his evolution as an intellectual, as a political activist, his understanding of slavery and how it changed over time, so that he became, in the end, oh yes, he was a spokesman against the slave trade, but no, he was a spokesman against slavery. The slave trade was nothing more than political expediency, because it was expected that the British public and others could be mobilized against the trade sooner and quicker than they could against the institution as a whole, because it was so barbaric. And because he was such a prominent spokesman of exactly what had happened in those middle passages. And if you read those sections, and those of you, I'm sure many of you do, know very well about falling into the latrines on board the ship if you're a child, about the way women were being treated. You don't have to read much between the lines of what he's writing to understand what he saw and did and what he was reporting. And you can well imagine on those speaking tours that he went, and he was a good speaker, if the situation warranted, he would have gone into more detail. No problem at all. But the 4 cases I want to talk about is, the first is with, at a certain point, one of his closest friends, a guy by the name of John Annis, who had once been a slave in St. Kitts, but who had somehow got to England, had asserted his freedom, but then was in danger of being re-enslaved and taken back to the Caribbean. And Vasa did his best to try to make sure that that didn't happen. He failed. They were on board the Union Stairs, which was a ship that was bound for the Mediterranean. Vasa had got Annis a job as a cook on board that ship. And they were ready to set sail when his former master, by the name of Kirkpatrick, showed up from St. Kitts, and with the connivance of the captain of the Union Stairs, they kidnapped Annis. Vasa then tried to get a habeas corpus, a writ of habeas corpus, following on the Somerset case that Lord Mansfield had presided over. The Somerset case said that no one could really be taken from England without their consent. Didn't matter whether they were a slave or free or anything. It did not end slavery. It just said, if somebody didn't want to leave England, you can't make them. That's all. That would have been enough for Annis. It was enough for Somerset to protect them. The thing is, however, is Kirkpatrick, who lived right near St. Paul's Cathedral, hid Annis very well, understood what was going on, and got him onto his ship and got him back to St. Kitts anyway, by just not having the writ served on him. And of course, when poor Annis got back to St. Kitts, he was beaten to death. Now, in trying to protect Annas, Vasa made his first contacts with Granville Sharp, who was one of the most prominent of the abolitionists and one of the earliest to speak out against the slave trade and slavery and to write extensively about it. And Granville Sharp and Vasa maintained a relationship right until Vasa's deathbed in 1797. The last person that we know that visited Vasa was Sharp. And there were many times over the course of the intervening period from 1774 to 1797 that the two were in contact. In December 1774, Vasa experienced conversion. And it's no question that the Annas case was one of the things that drove him to convert. That's when he became a Huntingdonian Methodist, followers of the Countess of Huntingdon. This was crucial because the distinction here among the Methodists were between the followers of the Wesleys and the followers of the Countess of Huntingdon. The Huntingdonians believed in predestination, which has a strong analogy, comparison with Vasa's own Igbo upbringing and his belief in a personal chi, a personal God that every person acquires upon birth, an individual deity that in effect has predetermined everything that will happen to the person in the person's life. And I certainly follow Rosalind Shaw and Paul Edwards in accepting that this belief in chi is something that he carried with him later in life and explains his connections with the Huntingdonians. That connection I'll explore more than I will now. But the second, maybe I even have Mansfield. The second experience relates to Vasa's adventures on the Mosquito Shore of Central America. Mosquito Shore, roughly from what's on the map here is Black River, which today is Rio Tinto, all the way down to really the border, the San Juan River, which is here, that comes from Lake Nicaragua and is the border between modern Nicaragua and Costa Rica. This whole stretch of coast was a protectorate that where the Miskitu lived. Miskitu is a language that is an Amerindian language, although the population is mixed African and Amerindian. And they were organized in what they called a kingdom, and they were a dependency of Jamaica in the 18th century. They were the British official in charge was known as a superintendent and was appointed from Kingston, and the various political figures that were the heads of the Miskitu were all appointed and confirmed in their appointments in Kingston, or in one case at least in London. So there was a very strong connection between the Miskitu and the British Empire. A willing relationship, not an imposed one. Now, it's only in the English language that there's confusion over the name of these people, Miskitu and Mosquito. There's no connection. It's called the Mosquito Shore because the people who lived there were mosquito, not because there were mosquitoes there, although there are. In Spanish, you see, it doesn't work. They were still called mosquito in Spanish, but mosquitoes are not called mosquitoes in Spanish. Cinquero. One of my few Spanish words. Anyway. Vasa became involved in a very harebrained scheme by his employer, the one with the apparatus that turned seawater into drinking water, Dr. Charles Irving. Dr. Charles Irving was involved with Alexander Blair and Keir and various other people, all of whom were industrialists, former military officers, all of whom, except Irving, made fortunes afterwards. But Alexander Blair and Dr. Charles Irving decided they were going to invest in a plantation on the Mosquito Shore near the mouth of the Rio Grande de Matagalpa, which is between Bluefields and Bilwi today, modern terminology. Did I have a map there? Yeah. Here's the Rio Grande here. They're going to start a plantation there. What to do? Because the Jamaican Assembly had decreed that it was illegal for any British subjects to grow sugar cane on the Mosquito Shore. They didn't want any competition from sugar cane from Jamaica. So no sugar cane. But they weren't after sugar cane anyway. They were after castor oil. Castor oil comes from this plant, which at the time grew wild all up and down the coast of what's the Atlantic coast of what's now Nicaragua. And they were going to harvest the castor oil bean for purposes of taking it to England, because castor oil, before the use of petroleum for a lubricant for machinery, was a very good substitute. It was also a very good substitute in making all kinds of things. And since the people that Vasa was connected with, these industrialists, I'll get into this tomorrow more, were some of the leading industrialists in Europe during the Industrial Revolution, they were experimenting. As it turns out, castor oil is great for varnish, it's great for paint, it's great in plastics, it's great in so many things, it's unbelievable. So they weren't really far off in a particular kind of way, although this experiment completely failed. But not the end of the story on the Mosquito Shore, because the mosquito themselves, Vasa gets it all wrong in his autobiography. He gets every detail just about wrong. So this is a section of the biography, of the autobiography, that we have to read very carefully and try to understand what the heck he did and saw and what he thought he was doing. He thought he was converting the mosquito to Christianity. Well, the mosquito were already Christians. The Moravian mission had been there for 20 years already. One, what he misunderstood was the mosquito were anti-Catholic beyond anything. And they loved the book that Vasa got at his baptism, which showed all of the Catholic saints in the most weird positions and everything. And they loved looking at this book as if it was a comic book, laughing at it and everything like this. This was there. So he thought he was going to convert them. The other is that one of the delegation that had gone to London among the mosquito that he got involved with turned out to be, his name was George. His daddy was King George I of the Mosquito Nation, and he thought King George III in England was his brother. And guess what? Within a year, King George I died of smallpox. So Vasa's friends, who he tried to convert to Christianity, became King George II. So his interactions, again, were quite beyond anything that he understood what was going on. But he did take part in that venture. he, with Irving and Blair, stopped in Jamaica. They bought a lot of newly arrived slaves from Igbo land to take to the Mosquito Shore. Vasa mistakenly thinking, because of his religious conversion to Huntingdonianism, that he was going to convert them all. They were all going to become free and as happy as he was. Well, when he started operating the plantation to do the castor oil business, he discovered that's not the way slavery operated. And I argued that actually it was on the Mosquito Shores where he actually changed his mind and decided that slavery couldn't be reformed in anywhere, and where he became an absolute abolitionist and anti-slavery advocate. And it was there that he really saw the transformation. He quit his job and he made his way back to London. The next incident is the Zong affair. Now, the Zong was a slave ship, picked up its people on the Gold Coast, and missed Jamaica, went further east than Jamaica, ran out of water and stuff, and then killed 132 slaves on board so they can collect insurance, the owners. And it became a court case before Lord Mansfield again, because the insurance company didn't want to pay. They said, no, you killed these people, we won't pay. We had to kill them or we would have all died. Except actually, they said we ran out of water, except that it was proven that, you know, there had been torrential rainfall the day before they were all killed, which means there was water on board. So it had nothing to do with water, it had to do with the decision to try to collect insurance. Vasa is the one who brought this to the attention of Granville Sharp. And Granville Sharp was the one who then tried to make this an issue, and although it didn't immediately become an issue among abolition circles, it sure did by 1789, and it was then well known. But again, Vasa was there. He was the one who actually tipped off the whole incident. And finally, so Granville Sharp keeps showing up. Finally, something he didn't know about when he wrote his book, but he must have been absolutely fascinated when he heard all about it in the parliamentary inquiries, was the notorious massacre that occurred at Calabar in the Bight of Biafra, not far from where he would have left, 1767. There were 6 British ships in the river. Ships like that one, although that wasn't one of them. And this, the lower picture is one of the river boats that were used to transport people and goods and everything in this area. And some of these were so large that they had a cannon mounted in the middle of the boat. English language has a real problem with what we call these things. And in the literature and in the sources, they're often called canoes, but that ain't no canoe. Something that carries 80 to 100 people is not a canoe. When I was younger, I did a lot of camping up in Algonquin Park in northern Ontario. You know, it's pretty difficult to get more than 2 people in a canoe, a real canoe. So these are real river boats, and they're quite substantial, obviously. And they're not only used for trade, they're also used for fighting and for protecting territory. But this is the Cross River, which is not part of the Niger Delta, although it's linked to the Niger Delta, which is over here. And Bonnie is over there somewhere beyond the shade. the river goes up here like this, and there's a branch of it which is called the Calabar River, which goes over here. And it's for that reason that this place is called Calabar, because it's on the Calabar branch of the Cross River Delta. And the town actually exists of a series of scattered settlements, a Creek Town here, Old Town, Duke Town, and Henshaw Town, and there are others. And they're perhaps confusingly in the literature and in the sources, and even today, they're referred to as town, and the more accurate word is they're a ward. They're a ward of the town, but they're each called a separate town. And in 1767, the inhabitants of Old Town and Duke Town, with their allies from Creek Town, were on a collision course that led to a massacre. The 6 British ships that were involved, one of them apparently abstained from action, but the other 5 were deliberately involved in a conspiracy to convince all the merchants from Old Town to come on board ship, and that they would have a meeting between the Old Town and the Duke Town merchants and solve all their differences so that the trade could continue unmolested and everyone would go home happy. Except that the leaders in Duke Town and the British merchant had decided as soon as the Old Town merchants showed up, they were going to kill them all. Just a slight aside, you have to understand that the nature of government in Calabar, there was no central government. It wasn't part of a larger state. It was really organized on the basis of the different towns or different wards. And each one was acted like a family. And they conducted trade and they did their business and they negotiated with the other leaders elsewhere through a secret society, the Ekpe Society, which is a society named after a leopard. It's referred to in the literature as a secret society. There was nothing really secret about it. Everybody knew who was in it. All the males were in it, no females. All the males were in it. They were in 7 grades. Everyone knew who was at the top grade. They were the most powerful men. Simple as that. There was no secret. The only secrecy was about it, like the Masons, is that they had a secret language. They had a secret type of writing on the skin and on buildings and stuff, and called them sibi, which are pictograph type things, very complicated. And to understand those, you have to go through an initiation and you have to learn what they mean and what they do and all this, that, and the other thing. So the only secret about it was having to learn the secret language. The other secrecy was about it is whenever the Ekpe Society decided that something had to be done because someone hadn't paid their debt or somebody was doing something wrong or something like that, they would move as a group to deal with them. In some ways, they're like a motorcycle gang. You know, they police themselves internally. They don't have anything to do with external authorities. If it becomes necessary for the Hells Angels to fight the Bandito, they will. But it's a decision that's made at that level. The same way with drug cartels. It's the same. They police themselves. In the same way here, they police themselves. And Ekpe was the way that they did that. Except it obviously broke down in 1767 because one side thought they were going into some peaceful negotiations and the other side knew it was a trap. So that was a story. That was an amazing story. He didn't know about it until 1789 when people like Ambrose Lace from Liverpool and others were called before and asked about it. And so many people testified before Parliament, oh yeah, I was there. Oh yeah, we killed them all. Ambrose Lace, no, I wasn't there. Where everybody else says, Ambrose Lace was the leader. You know, this is what's going on. Why Lace didn't go to jail is another, who knows, but that's what happens with these testimonies. So what that would have done for Vasa, when he goes out on his book tour, he can talk about it. He didn't write about it because he didn't know about it before he started writing. This is one of Ambrose Lace's letters that survive. They actually didn't kill everybody. They took two of the Robin Johns, two of the leaders in Duketown, to Barbados, and then they went to Virginia. They ended up in England, and they ended up staying and living with the Wesley brothers for a while until they were ultimately sent back to Calabar, where, needless to say, they became slave traders again, which is what they were. So here he's talking about how much money he's spent on the two boys. He keeps referring to them as boys. They weren't boys, they were men. Randy Sparks has written a great book on that incident, and we have a forthcoming volume which will include all the documentation that has anything to do with that massacre. It's going to be a book. That's how much documentation there is. So for me, the issues have been, how to assess remembered experiences at different ages of life. How do we establish context that the subject might not have understood himself? And I'm only referring to males because this is a male himself, but it would be the same in accounts that we have of women who experienced slavery. It's the same kind of problem. The only problem with accounts by women is that by comparison there are so few that we've been able to find. But we're very aware of that bias. But in this case, what can we surmise to have happened given time and place of events? And as you'll see tomorrow and the next day, I strongly influenced by the methodology of Natalie Zeman Davis and her concept of historical imagination. You put two people in the same room at the same time, even though you don't have any evidence that they were there, but they were both there, then they talked with each other. You may not have any proof, but they talked with each other. So the same thing, I use that type of technique to try to look at different individuals that Vasa came in contact with or came near or might have come in contact with, and to find out what we can know about them. And so how do we assemble networks that we only may have fragments of those networks in existence? So these are the subjects that I want to explore in my talk tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Emmanuel, would you like to ask the first question? Okay. I'm sure the one word that is lingering in people's minds is circumcision. Could you explain? And I remember when I called you once after Vincent Corretto said, you have to understand, it would be like someone saying Pushkin wasn't Russian, right? This is the father of African literature and English. And all of a sudden he's born in South Carolina, according to this, these two documents. So Vincent Corretto jumped on this and said, Equiano is really an American. And Paul is the leader of he's an African. That means that Paul could be elected mayor of in Sokka, Igbo land.
Actually, it demonstrates my anti-Americanism.
Yeah, well, it could be too. But you said to me that the crucial bit of evidence was the fact that he was circumcised. He says that he was circumcised. So could you riff on that? Slaves weren't circumcised in America. Americans weren't circumcising their children. I don't know anything about the history of circumcision. So.
Well, we do know that in Suriname, there was some circumcision of slaves by Jewish slave owners. So I'm not saying it didn't happen in some places. We have no other evidence at all that anybody who was enslaved in South Carolina was circumcised. We have no evidence that anybody in Jamaica was. Not that he was from Jamaica or that anybody's saying that. I'm just saying there is, throughout the Americas, with the exception of Suriname, I don't know of any place where circumcision was practiced. And by English, Scottish owners, they wouldn't have allowed it. They were against it. It was
When did circumcision become popular among white Americans and white English people?
when?
Yeah, I mean, when did they start circumcising?
Well, I'm crossing. I don't know.
I mean,
don't know.
I'm just curious.
I'm not into modern circumcision, but it's a medical thing very often now.
Oh, no, I know. Now, I mean, everybody, my whole generation was circumcised. I just wonder when in the history of the United States and England it became a common practice, if you know, since it's such a crucial bit of evidence.
As far as I know, it was not a common practice before the end of the 19th century.
Oh, okay. That's fascinating. And none of the slaves. I mean, why would they, right?
Why would they?
Sure. That's interesting.
And,
So how does
and
Coretta-
moreover, in terms of Igbo, if they were going to circumcise, it was a ritual connected with institutions. And so therefore you have to have a critical mass of Igbo who are allowed to or somehow managed to continue certain practices that had meaning on one side of the ocean that don't have meaning anymore.
Right. Well, when did the Igbo circumcise a boy?
Before age 7.
Before age 7. Oh, that's interesting. Huh. Questions, comments? Please.
Although let me qualify that one thing. I'm saying before age 7, but again, like a lot of these subjects, in some ways we don't really know entirely because it certainly would have varied, I assume.
But the point is, it was circumcision was practiced by the Igbo. He was
By all Igbo.
All Igbo. He says he was circumcised. People in South Carolina did not circumcise the Africans that they owned. Sounds pretty convincing to me. How does Coretta respond to that argument?
He hasn't, as far as I know.
I see. Okay. All right. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. And I guess my question is about Vin Coretta's investment in this narrative. So not to ask you to kind of ventriloquize for him, but what is his investment in locating Gustavus Vassa in an American context and discrediting, his origins, right? And if you don't want to kind of speak to on his behalf, like more broadly, I guess, is what's at stake, right, in the debate? I got a good sense of like what's at stake historically in establishing that origin, but what do you see, or can you talk more about what's at stake in this current debate?
Well, to a great extent, I would have to speculate because I certainly am not going to speak for Vincent, although we've talked about this, needless to say. I mean, who's the self-made man? Equiano or Coretta? Who gets the mileage out of this debate? Vasa's a loser. I mean, that's one part of my answer. And then also, to be fair, Coretta doesn't categorically, although no, it's very, very mixed. If you actually look very carefully at everything that Vincent has written about this, and I hope that I have, unless something new has just come out very, very, very recently, most of the time he vacillates. He could have been born in South Carolina. He could have been born in Igbo land. And in in his book, it's actually strange, for me, is strange, because he has a long part of his book where he presents an argument as if Vasa was born in Igbo land. And then he presents a whole bunch of other information which questions whether he was. So it's never really clear, could it have been there or could it have been here? And this is his answer. I mean, it seemed, I don't know, maybe it's a difference between literary criticism and history. For a historian, somebody can only be born in one place. We have to make a decision. I suppose you can do anything you want in that other discipline, which I don't know very much about. I learned most about it by reading Signifying Monkey, but which was very influential, which I didn't say, but it was very influential in terms of the way I approached Vasa. And reading those insights and seeing not only what Skip was doing, but seeing what other literary scholars and so on were doing with this guy's life and stuff is very, very important. So that was part of the fascination, was that everybody had suddenly discovered this guy and loved him. And then there was these other problems. And when Coretta then published this thing saying that, you know, I'm not so sure, maybe he was born there rather than here, and, you know, that got me started. I was going to say some of this tomorrow, and probably I still will, but Coretta, on his own admission, says he came in contact and virtually fell in love with Equiano in 1991, which is when he first started doing work on it. I first started doing work on Equiano in 1967. When I was at Wisconsin, when Curtin published his Africa Remembered, and when Jan Bansina was going on and on, we don't have any African sources, we got to listen to the oral testimony, we studied that upside, downside, inside, outside. But the one thing I can tell you in all those discussions, all the debate, no one ever questioned where he was born. Never. We questioned whether G.I. Jones got it right about whether he was born on the east or bank of the Niger or the west bank of the Niger, but we didn't. And G.I. Jones, who knows Igbo society, knew Igbo society and language and everything so well, he never questioned. And Paul Edwards, who's the one who actually began calling the guy Equiano rather than Vasa, I can't prove it, but in my mind, I remember talking with Paul years and years ago. He's the first person who saw that baptismal record in St. Margaret's. I'm sure of it. I can't prove it. I've gone through everything that Paul ever wrote, no reference. So I don't know. I don't know if that really answers your question, but.
Yes.
Next question.
Yes, Gerald Rizzo, back to circumcision. The Afroterra
I told you.
The Afroterra Library has a secondary reference that Vasa circumcised himself.
What?
And I wanted to know if you have any evidence of pertaining to the Jewish faith that what age he was circumcised.
Wait a minute.
No,
Could
we
you
only
repeat
have-
that? Did you say that someone claimed he circumcised himself?
Yes.
Wow. He'd be a bad dude, man. That's all I got to say.
Well, I'm against that. No, we don't know his age. He never says, I was circumcised. What he said was, we now pass through a country where people didn't circumcise, and it's barbaric.
Right.
That's what he said. I don't know. I mean, only his wife knows for sure. I suppose. I don't know.
But that is strong evidence, you know.
It is.
Yeah, that's reasonable.
And his comparison with Jews, he says, you know, we're really a lot like Jews. We circumcise, they circumcise. And for ritual reasons, not for any, you know, for reasons that have to do with religion and have to do with society.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk today. I had a question about, could you elaborate a little bit on if Vasa ever explained why he chose that name, or like what was his investment in maintaining that name, as opposed to Equiano once he had been manumitted? I was just thinking, I have recently been reading, again, João Reis's book on the Malay Revolt. And in the interrogation of the rebels, many of whom were Yoruba-speaking Muslims, they said very clearly, our name is this in the land of the blacks, meaning in what is, you know, present-day Nigeria, and it's this in the land of the whites. So they clearly had, this is a later period, 1835, but they clearly had a sort of contextual sense of naming. And I was wondering if you see that at all in his writings.
No, on the name, it's clear. He only used the name Mulata Equiano. I'm going to get the number wrong now because I'm still counting. Maybe 7 times only. Once in the cover of his book, and then several letters that he wrote. He never used the name Equiano without also using the name Gustavus Vassa. He never used the name Mulata Equiano without also referring to himself as an African. Always, that's how he never signed his name or had anything to do with his name. I'm going to deal with this in greater detail tomorrow, actually, or sometime. I can't remember when, but I can tell you now. It's not that big of mystery. Gustavus Vassa, he was given that name by Michael Henry Pascal, his master, who was the ship captain, who was the officer in the 7 Years' War. When he was on board ship from Virginia to England, ending up in Guernsey in 1754. And one thing which I think is made up in the book is he talks about how much he resisted and protested the name. Well, that's baloney. Can you imagine how many enslaved people, when they were given a new name, protested as much as he said he protested? You know, he was a teenager. He was given a name. He'd already been given 2 names before that, both of which were biblical names. So he didn't have anything against, no sense that he objected to either of those names. So I question whether he really did object or even knew what it meant until later. And Gustavus Vassa was known in England in the 1750s and the 1740s because he was the subject of a very popular play that was banned by Walpole in his crackdown on theater, although the play itself circulated as a written text anyway, and indeed it was performed in musical when the theaters were closed down for plays because they were often political and anti-government, as the Gustavus Vassa one, because the Gustavus Vassa play was entitled Gustavus Vassa, Liberator of His People. Because King Gustavus Vasa I was the people in Swedish mythology and history who's remembered in the early 17th century of freeing Sweden from Danish rule and Danish tyranny. And in one part of that mythology, they refer to it as freeing Swedes from Danish bondage. And when Vasa understood his name and why he got the name, I'll get back to why he got the name in a minute, he understood because he was predestined to be Gustavus Vassa. He was predestined to be the liberator of his people and to lead Africans out of slavery. And he believed that. Why would he change his name? He's not denying his birth name. He uses his birth name. But by the way, in using his birth name, if anyone still wants to call him Equiano, you're making two mistakes. One, he never called himself that. Two, Equiano was not a surname. Igbo did not have surnames. His name was Walada Equiano, one name. So G.I. Jones, in Curtin's book published in 1967, and what we were studying as oral text was him and what he saw as a boy when his name was Walada Equiano. So we called him Walada Equiano. We were only interested in what he said about Africa from his experience. And G.I. Jones, he doesn't call him Equiano, he calls him Walada. Because he knows Igbo, he's fluent in the language, he lived there and everything. He knows the name was Walada Equiano, and if you're going to shorten that name in any way, you call him Walada, not Equiano. So there's the...
We have time for one more question before we join Paul back in the room, food and drink. Manuel?
Thank you very much for a great first installment.
Oh, there you go.
That's me on the
I'm looking for
series
the
of-
microphone.
on the series of 3 lectures. In your introduction, you mentioned that Olaudah Equiano was not only an abolitionist, but a person of the Enlightenment. And I know tomorrow we're looking at Vasa's associates as South of Africa and the Enlightenment. But I've been sort of thinking about how you position him. In the Enlightenment, he lived in the age. He's a product of the Enlightenment in terms of formative influences, or he's an actor in the Enlightenment. So I know this is tomorrow, but hoping you can give us a brief preview of your description of him as a person of the Enlightenment.
Well, it is what I hope I'm going to explain in greater detail tomorrow. Maybe, to answer you now, I would say he's of the same period, and the people that he's interacting with, and the people who he's reflecting, from Adam Smith to many of the scientists and industrialists that he came in contact with, his misguided, maybe naive, because he doesn't really explain how he becomes involved in these imperial projects. The Mosquito Shore one is particularly bizarre. It's particularly bizarre because if he'd actually stayed, he would have got caught up in later events when the British forces tried to invade the interior of Spanish America up the San Juan River to Lake Nicaragua with the intention of cutting the Spanish Empire in half and then arming the Aztec, the Maya, and the Inca and staging uprisings against. I mean, he was involved in some. They weren't his ideas, but he was there and he was participating in these types of things. And his engagement with slavery issue in terms of how he analyzed Barbados and stuff, he didn't question certain things. The way I read it, he didn't question certain things until he saw later that it didn't work. So I would say he's on the fringes of, he's interacting with the people that he goes on and meets and engages with in his book tours are all people that are associated with that enlightenment.
Paul, thank you for a wonderful beginning of your lecture series. Let's give it up for Paul Lovejoy, please.
Thank you.